Sony have been slowly updating their back catalogue of big PS4 titles since the PS5's launch. Not quite of the same ilk, effort or focus as the Big M, but certainly not without merit. It was only a matter of time though that one of the biggest got its turn in the sun. But have the gods smiled on us BC players once again? Let's find out. First things first, like previous updates, do not expect a great deal from this patch, as it is, for all intents and purposes, a regression update back to the day one disk code. As I have discussed before, disk code can be a treasure or a curse, but with next gen power BC it can enable us to get glimpses of the possibilities. Games such as AC Unity run unlocked frame rates, and even though its 900p resolution remains on the PS5, it is now largely a 60 FPS title. The same as Sekiro, which unlocked on all versions, even patched for the Pro, and we can now see a locked 60 FPS. Some games are truly transformative though, such as The Last Guardian, which on the disc version you can also enjoy a near 4K checkerboard resolution and 60 FPS, whereas before it was borderline unplayable. Now, unlike that game though, Sony Santa Monica has been able to bring that day one code back into patch 1.35, which is almost the same, except it now adds in a new menu option for PS5, a 4K 30 as it used to be, or a 4K 60. That 1080p has been banished as it serves no purpose here at all. Now, the new best of both worlds takes the high-res Pro option and mixes it with that 60 FPS choice without the need to sacrifice the resolution. Aside all these, effects, animations, shadows and every lit particle are identical as that base console or Pro version. But not all things are equal. This absolutely cracking title on PlayStation 4 ran at 1080p and 30 FPS, with the Pro version offering a dual 3840 by 2160 resolution. Originally unlocked and then capped at 30 FPS, this high resolution achieved via checkerboard rendering, a hardware accelerated function of the Pro with its ID buffer on primitives, enabling them to be tracked across frames and thus support the accumulation of more than one frame into a single image, thus taking a lower resolution previous frame and an equal resolution current frame, blending them together into one image and resolve at a higher resolution. Now, many of these methods mean the engine renders each new frame at something around 1920 by 2160, and that each second pixel is either constructed of a previous frame's data via the ID buffer and velocity vectors, its colour, etc., or it's an interpolation of the surrounding pixels if no data is found to fall back on, such as off-screen elements coming into the frustum. Now, from this, a final 3840 by 2160p output is created, and in slow moving sections it looks excellent. Sure, it's not as good as true 4K, but it's much better than the base 1080p. The cost of this though is much lower than rendering 8 million pixels for every 4K image needed. About half actually, which helps fill rate, VRAM, bandwidth among other areas on the system. That said, it is more expensive than just rendering at that interim resolution. However, the engine needs to support it, so not all games can or did throughout the generation. Here though on the Pro, it meant that 30 FPS was your limit, as at times it can still dip under that, which you'll see on the analysis here. That 1080p mode though cuts all the load away and leaves us with an unlocked frame rate to run as free as the birds. And the results are generally very good. Far from a locked 60, it certainly felt better to play thanks to faster input times which translate to more responsive controls, and it looks better with a lower static resolution but a higher temporal one due to that 16 millisecond frame time now, that refresh matching most TV's native VSync level. As you can see though, it can spend more time under 60 than that 30 mode with a softer IQ to boot. And at points which you'll see in this analysis, it can go right back down to 30. And this is where the PS5's backwards compatibility mode comes in. Now we no longer need to choose between resolution or frame rate, we get both. This is possible due to the PS5 having hardware-based backwards compatibility. In short, this means that the PS5's SoC can run its CPU and GPU logic at the required frequencies of the base PS4, the Pro, or an enhanced PS5 rate. With such a solution, it enables the code to run in the most stable level, and it looks like we are having to run that at Core Pro levels here. That means that we get a CPU frequency of 8 cores at 2.1 GHz and a GPU of 911 MHz, something we can validate with the loading test. Now, in these modes, the inherent I/O and SSD of the PS5 is not being used, and that means the comparison here should be limited by 4 things: the speed of the drive, the bandwidth of the comms channel, the frequency of the CPU, and the inherent game code underneath. I stress that a lot. Now, all these combine to give us an 18% speed boost over the Pro, which itself has an SSD with around 500 megabytes of read speeds. If we surmise that the CPU is the limiting the Pro here, then a 3.5 GHz Zen 2 should be around 39% faster. With the SSD being a factor of 11 times over itself, that shouldn't really factor into this conversation. It's more than enough to meet the demands. But in full Pro BC mode here, we're only getting around 5 seconds improvement on loading. Very good and beneficial, but certainly indicative of the system not being used fully. Now, should this scare us then? Are we going to expect lower results after this loading test? After all, we're going to be comparing a game that is running at a 50% greater pixel count at 60 FPS at the same clocks as the old Pro. Well, as you can see, the difference is transformative in itself. The game now doesn't drop a single frame. I tested loads of this game and I couldn't find any point. I'm sure there is somewhere hidden in it, but you would never feel it, you would never see it outside of a frame rate analysis. And there's certainly points here on the Pro where we can find to stress out the PS5 and what it's actually doing. Certainly in combat it can hover around the low 50s and the high 40s, but in the Lake of 9 it can cause the Pro to dip right into the 30s and almost go below it at points. There certainly skips into 67 milliseconds at certain points, but generally skipping between 16 and 50 milliseconds at that 1080p resolution, you can see that it struggles to hold anywhere near 60, and it feels like a 30 FPS game at this point. It's a very dense area on the GPU and possibly CPU with lots of draw cores. It's got alpha billboards, particle effects, screen space reflections, dense geometry, again on Kratos and the shading effects on his body, and here even going through the door when there's not much on screen. It's potentially a culling issue in the background, who knows, but the Pro is down to 30 and the PS5 never drops below 60. Once inside, the Pro goes back up to 60 FPS. Overall, the improvements to the title are quite staggering at certain points, like here, where it can go from a 30 FPS 1080p game on the PS4 Pro to a 4K 60 FPS game on the PS5. Now obviously the PS4 Pro holds close enough to 60 to still feel much better than 30 FPS mode, but any areas in the title where these dips did occur, and they can happen in some of the combat sections like I say, that is now completely eradicated, and it feels much more responsive and fluid for that faster input time. And all that for free on your disc or downloaded version is a great boost to the God of War title on the PS4 for PS5 players, and I'm pretty sure that it will ramp up that impact in the very soon to be shown sequel to this epic 2018 title. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this and the deep dive look at these performance titles. If you do, keep it IGN and check back soon for much more.